Welcome to another video for History Valley Podcast, and today I am doing an in-person interview with Professor Jodi Magness. So we're going to be talking about the daily life of Jesus, and I'll have a link to her book in the description below. And that being said, it's great to have you here, Jodi. It's for first time in-person interviewing you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you in person,
Yeah,
Jacob.
same here.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about what are the footprints in archaeology and texts? What is that?
Footprints. You mean what kind of information do we learn about people's daily lives from text versus archaeology, right? It's interesting. That's a really interesting question because both texts, literary works, and archaeology provide evidence of daily life in antiquity, but they provide different kinds of evidence. And sometimes that evidence is complementary, and sometimes it might seem contradictory. So it actually depends on what you're looking at. In terms of texts, it's important to remember that pretty much overall, the people who wrote the texts that we read were members of the upper class.
Mm-hmm.
They were male. And so what they wrote tends to reflect their viewpoint and what they're familiar with. Even if they're writing about, let's say, lower class people, again, it's going to be presented from their point of view. And they're generally going to focus on topics that don't include necessarily all aspects of ancient daily life. Mm-hmm. For the most part, they're writing about major events, wars, the construction of important buildings, the rules of kings, whatever. And so we learn from literary texts about certain aspects of ancient daily life, but we don't get a complete picture. And it is a biased picture, what we do learn. Archaeology, on the other hand, presents an unfiltered view of ancient daily life in the sense that it's not coming to us through a secondary source like somebody who's writing about it. But it's also important to remember that archaeology also provides only a partial view of ancient daily life, because the vast majority of what happened in ancient daily life is not preserved in the archaeological record. The people are gone. Most of the items that they had are gone. So all organic materials, generally speaking, clothing is not preserved. Artifacts made of leather, furniture made of wood. For the most part, these sorts of things are not preserved. And in addition, archaeology doesn't really give us information about what happened in any given place every single day.
Right.
It will usually show us what the picture was at the very end of that period of occupation or whatever. And so it's so generally speaking, as archaeologists, what we will find will be a lot of pottery, some coins, glass, objects made of stone, for example, or features made of stone, immovable installations, walls, things like that. We will dig up the remains of, let's say, houses or rooms, but it's often very difficult for us to determine who used or lived in those rooms and exactly what purpose they would have been used for, especially over a period of time. What is good about archaeology is that it's relatively egalitarian in the sense that, or at least more so than the texts, in the sense that we have remains associated with all ancient populations and not just upper class male populations. So we have houses that were inhabited by women, children, slaves. The problem is identifying those sorts of populations in the archaeological record. So we have two different bodies of evidence, but they're both incomplete. One of them is biased, and they don't necessarily overlap, or at least they certainly don't overlap completely. But it is very important when studying the past to draw on all of the available sources of information that we have together to try and get as complete a picture as we can.
Will it sometimes be the case where sometimes we get some evidence from archaeology, but the text fills in the blanks, and sometimes the text doesn't tell us enough, and sometimes the archaeology fills in the blanks?
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely the case. And a great example of that would be, for example, the site of Masada. Herod's palace is on Masada. So we knew, even before al-Yadin excavated Masada in the 1960s, that Herod had built a fortified palace on top of the mountain. We knew before Yadin's excavations that the site was occupied by Jewish rebels at the time of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, that there was a Roman siege either in 73 or 74, and then the mountain falls. And then what happens is Yadin excavates and he finds evidence of those events reflected in the archaeology, and the archaeological remains that Yadin found filled out the picture that we got from the information that the ancient Jewish historian Josephus had provided about the mountain.
What are the connections between Jesus and the food laws?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really like to emphasize is that, in contrast to what many people might think, Jesus was a Jew, and the fact that he was a Jew living in the late Second Temple period, so first century BC, first century AD, means that he took for granted, just like all other Jews did, that as a Jew you observe biblical laws, and that includes dietary laws, for example. And so it is not the case that Jesus rejected the need to observe biblical law. However, he had his own opinions, in some cases at least, about the interpretation of those laws. And it was, in fact, on points of interpretation that Jews were divided from each other in this period. Different groups of Jews had different opinions about how to correctly interpret and practice those biblical laws. They all agreed on the need to observe the laws, but they're laws. How do you correctly observe? We can see even in the United States today how the Supreme Court, for example, has interpreted the same laws differently over the course of time. And so this was true also in the late Second Temple period. Jesus absolutely took for granted the need to observe biblical laws, but he had, in some cases at least, especially as presented in the gospel accounts, his own interpretations about how to correctly observe those laws.
What does the Damascus document tell us about the Qumranian view of Leviticus and Deuteronomy?
Yeah, the Qumran sect, which is the sect that lived at Qumran and used the Dead Sea Scrolls and deposited them in the nearby caves. This is a Jewish sect that, together with many other scholars, I identify as a group of Essenes. Also, like Jesus, by the way, like everybody else, believed that it was necessary to observe and practice biblical laws. They were distinguished by having a somewhat stricter interpretation of the law, at least in many cases, than other Jewish groups did. And just to give you one example, so according to most Jews, the way most Jews interpret this law, you're not allowed to consume blood, right? So when you slaughter an animal, the blood has to be completely drained before you're allowed to consume the meat of that animal. Well, the Qumran sect actually applied this law to fish, so that when you slaughtered and ate a fish, you first had to drain the blood. That's something exceptional. So in many cases, we find that they take these biblical laws and they actually extend them beyond what was obvious to other Jews.
Can you tell us about Matthew 23:24, alluding to the halakhic controversy before and after 70 CE?
So you're referring to the washing of the hands,
Yeah,
right? Yes.
yeah.
So I really like this passage a lot, and actually this whole episode, where of course Jesus and his disciples are criticized by the Pharisees for not washing their hands before they eat, and Jesus's response is very interesting. Jesus calls them hypocrites, and he cites a passage from Isaiah in doing so. And he basically says, you're hypocrites who worship with your outward with outward gestures, but not with your hearts. And then he says something about how, and I don't recall the exact biblical quote, but he says something about how you observe the laws of the fathers, the laws of the ancestors, but you do not observe divine law, that is biblical law. That's basically the gist of what he says. Now, the basis for this disagreement is very interesting. The Pharisees, in their approach to the interpretation of biblical law, believed or had an approach which is usually referred to as oral law. What's oral law? So you have divine law and you have oral law. Divine law are the laws written in the 5 books of Moses, right? The Pentateuch or the Torah. Those are laws that are biblically mandated by God. There were Jewish groups in the late Second Temple period that believed that you had to observe the laws in the 5 books of Moses in a very rigid and literal manner. The best example of a group like that is the Sadducees. The Sadducees believed that divine law was divine. Those laws in the 5 books of Moses were divine, and therefore, as humans, we are not allowed to go beyond them. We are not allowed to reinterpret them. We must adhere literally to the letter of the law. That's the approach of the Sadducees. I like to say, by the way, that the late Chief Justice Antonin Scalia was a Sadducee in terms of his approach to the law. The Pharisees were distinguished from the Sadducees in this regard, in believing that you could take those laws in the 5 books of Moses and then interpret them and expand upon them, or interpret them in different ways, not necessarily, strictly speaking, literally. That approach, by the way, that oral law approach, is the approach that eventually was adapted after 70 and adopted by the rabbis, and which continues in Judaism until today. So eventually it was the approach of the Pharisees that became dominant in Judaism. And so this approach of oral law is what leads the Pharisees then to an innovation, which is washing hands before you eat. That's not mandated in the 5 books of Moses. It doesn't say that you have to wash your hands before you eat. That is a Pharisaic innovation according to their approach to the oral law. So what the Pharisees do is that they criticize Jesus and his disciples for not washing their hands before they eat. Jesus's response is to call them hypocrites who do not correctly observe divine law. And in support of his position, he cites scripture. He cites Isaiah.
Can you tell us a bit about the hand washing and internal versus external purity?
Right. And this is also very good. This is also embedded in Jesus's response, right? So he then builds on this to say that the Pharisees, and you see this elsewhere, by the way, where there's a passage where Jesus reportedly criticizes the Pharisees for external shows of piety, right? They wear their fringes long and they occupy the prominent seats in the synagogue, right? So this is kind of an internal versus external piety kind of thing. So in calling them hypocrites, Jesus also emphasizes that their concern is with external appearances and external purity, whereas he emphasizes internal purity, meaning moral behavior, right? So that's his concern. And again, this is his basis for calling them hypocrites.
Can you tell us about the observance of the Sabbath and fasting?
Yeah, this is actually also a really interesting thing. So there's a Judaism does not, normative Judaism, by which I mean Judaism today, not only does not prohibit, sorry, let me put this otherwise. Today, Jews on the Sabbath eat, right? They have, actually the rabbis mandated that you should eat on the Sabbath. But we have hints that there were Jewish groups in the Second Temple period who fasted on the Sabbath. And this is based on, again, an interpretation of a biblical passage, in this case, Exodus, which says that the Sabbath should be a delight to you, oneg. And the question is, how do you interpret that? So eventually, most Jews came to understand that passage's meaning, that you should enjoy the Sabbath and that you should eat on the Sabbath. But there were some Jewish groups, apparently, that understood that passage as meaning that you should devote the day to the study of the Torah, to the study of the law, and not eat on that day. Now, the evidence for fasting on the Sabbath among Jews in this period is a little bit unreliable, because pretty much all of it comes from outside sources like Roman authors who talk about Jews fasting on the Sabbath, or who will mention it incidentally. But I actually think that there is pretty good evidence that some Jews did, in fact, fast on the Sabbath in this period. And that then leads us back to the Qumran sect, the sect associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, this community of apparently Essenes at Qumran. So they also ate on the Sabbath. They did. They ate food and drink. We have evidence of that. It's talked about in their scrolls, it mandates, but they did it with very strict regulations. So yes, you're supposed to eat on the Sabbath. All Jews accept that, at least today. But you're not allowed to cook on the Sabbath, because that's work. So you're not allowed to cook. So how do you kind of get around that? The cooking thing comes from another prohibition in the 5 books of Moses, where it says that you may not kindle a fire on the Sabbath. Now, the rabbis, who again their rulings became normative until today, understood this, and their predecessors, the Pharisees, understood this as meaning that you could have a fire already kindled before the Sabbath
Mm.
and leave it burning during the Sabbath, and then you can heat your food or you can boil your water or whatever. And until today, by the way, that's what observant Jews do. They'll have like a hot plate, they'll have cooked food on it, and they'll leave the hot plate on over the course of the Sabbath. The Qumran sect, which was always a little bit stricter, almost always a little bit stricter in their interpretation, understood this passage as meaning that you may not even keep a fire burning on the Sabbath. But because they did understand that you must eat on the Sabbath, what they did was to pre-prepare all of the food that they would eat on the Sabbath and have it ready in advance.
What is the connection between the Zizit and the Qumran sect?
The which?
The Zizit.
Oh, the
TZIT.
tzitzit.
The
The
Yeah,
tzitzit,
I think I
right.
was mispronouncing it.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So, tzitzit, which, if for your listeners, is TZITZIT. Those are the fringes that are worn by observant Jews, right, on the corners of their mantles. Now, this actually is an interesting thing. So, this again goes back to the understanding of a biblical passage, right, which is about wearing fringes on the corners of your mantles. To understand this, you actually have to understand what ancient clothing looked like. So in antiquity, pretty much everybody in the ancient Roman world wore the same garments. Men, women, children, slaves, soldiers, they all wore the same basic garments. The difference was what the garments were made of, what the colors of the garments were, whether they were short or long, whether they had long sleeves or short sleeves, whether they were belted, but it's the same garments. So the basic article of clothing that was worn universally is something called a tunic. A tunic, if you want to visualize it, is like a one-piece dress or a shift, and you basically pull it over you. And it can be long, it can be short, meaning it can be knee length, it can be ankle length, or somewhere in between. It may have sleeves, it may have short sleeves, it may be sleeveless, but that's the universal garment that's worn by everybody. And if you wanted, you could belt it at the waist, and if you needed to pull it up sometimes so you could move around, you could do that. And then over the tunic, you would wear a mantle. A mantle is like a cloak. So for most people, it was a big rectangular sheet of cloth, and you would wear it around you, and you would sort of wrap it around, and you would basically wrap it around you in a way that would leave your right hand free so that you could work, and then it was kind of wrapped around your left arm. And everybody wore those. Jews had tassels, had these fringes attached to the corners of their mantles. And I'm sure most, if not all of your listeners, are familiar with the prayer shawl that Jews wear in synagogue today. That prayer shawl, what's called the talit, which has the fringes on it, actually derives from the ancient mantles. That's what it comes from. So the fringes were an article that were worn by ancient Jews, or at least some ancient Jews, on the fringes of their mantle. And I should qualify, I think probably males. I don't know that we have evidence that women had the fringes, but anyway, so this leads to the question of what evidence do we have of this? So first of all, in terms of archaeology, we have basically zero evidence of fringes. I mean, we don't have actual articles of clothing with actual mantles that have fringes attached to them. We do have remains of mantles that were worn by Jews at sites like Masada, for example, at the Bar Kokhba caves in the Judean desert. And there's no clear evidence of tassels. There was a suggestion by Yigael Yadin that the ones in the Cave of Letters had tassels, but it's really unconvincing. So we don't have archaeological remains of mantles with tassels. We also don't have clear depictions of tassels in depictions of Jews from this period. There's a little bit of a debate about painting in the Dor Europos synagogue, which is a little bit later, but we don't have clear evidence of tassels in Jewish art or in paintings or in art that depicts Jews in this period. So then that leaves us with the literary evidence, right? So we have, for example, that reference again to Jesus criticizing the Pharisees for being ostentatious in their display of piety by wearing the fringes on their mantles long, right, as a display of piety. And then we get to this passage in the Gospels where a woman who's hemorrhaging, right, wants to be healed by Jesus. And she's like, maybe if I touch his garment, right, maybe I'll be healed. And she doesn't want to actually come into contact with him because she's impure because of her bleeding. So she doesn't want to cause him to be ritually impure. But she says, maybe if I can just reach and touch the tassels, the fringes, right, of his cloak, maybe then I will be healed. So, was that it? Is that an accurate depiction that Jesus actually wore a fringed cloak or not, right? A fringed mantle. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Hard to know to what extent that particular episode in the gospel accounts is historically accurate. But I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus wore a mantle with fringes on it. I mean, it's quite possible. Why not? It's just hard to ascertain absolutely.
So is Jesus, or Jesus as portrayed by the Gospels, frequently then, does it look like to you that he was rewritten to be turned into a critic of certain Qumran laws and Jewish ways in certain circumstances?
Well, so first of all, I don't think that there's anywhere, well, there's only one. First of all, I don't think there's anywhere in the gospel accounts where it's clear that Jesus is referring to something that the Essenes do. I don't see any direct connection there. There are places where Jesus engages in debates that were more broadly circulating among the Jewish population, but not directly at the Qumran sect. In fact, most of the times where you see Jesus engaging in debates with other Jewish groups in the gospel accounts, it's the Pharisees, which actually makes sense. I don't know that it's historical, but it makes sense because the Pharisees were apparently active in Galilee, had quite a bit of influence there. That's where Jesus is active. And so it does actually, in historical terms, make sense that his main interlocutors would have been the Pharisees. But more broadly speaking, what we see him doing is engaging in the kind of debates about specific points of interpretation and practice of Jewish law that were more generally being debated by at least some Jewish groups in that period. I'm not enough of an expert in the New Testament to be able to say to you to what degree the different gospel authors may have reworked, or at least the sources that they drew on, may have reworked their presentation of Jesus to fit their purposes, right? So I can't actually tell you that. I do think that for me at least, the gospel accounts, and especially the canonical, the synoptic gospels, and I always like to draw especially on Mark, and maybe to a lesser degree on Matthew. To me, they're presenting a picture of Jesus that is largely consistent with what we know about Jews and Judaism in this period. But again, that's not to say that everything that's in them is necessarily historically accurate, or that Jesus actually said or did these things, or that these things occurred.
I'd like to shift for a moment to toilets.
Yeah.
How did toilets work in the first century CE in the time of Jesus?
Right. People always love to hear about toilets. But I think actually it's an interesting topic because it's so human. It's something that we can all relate to, right? And people always wonder, well, what did they do back then anyway? I mean, we know what we do today, but what did they do back then? So in this period in the Roman world, there were different ways of relieving yourself when you had to use the toilet. And so I'm going to describe the different ways, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know from archaeology and from mainly the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus about this. So first of all, uh, many houses in the Roman world were not equipped with toilet facilities. In fact, probably a majority of houses in the Roman world, including in Judea, had no toilet facilities. And therefore, when you had to go, if you were in a house and you had to go, what you would do is use, well, the analogy would be a chamber pot, right? So you would take maybe the bottom half of a broken jar and you would use that. And then what would you do with the contents? You would toss them out into the street or the alley outside your house. So the streets and the alleys were filled with waste from toilets and other waste as well, that's coming from the houses along them. If you've ever been to Pompeii, for example, you will have noticed that the streets there are lined by sidewalks with very high curbs. And this
Mm.
was a big innovation because the waste was tossed out onto the streets, and there were fountains with water along the course of the streets, and the overflow from the fountains, which were fed by springs, would carry the waste away into a major drainage system. And therefore, the sidewalks along the streets and the pedestrians walking along the sidewalks were protected from walking through the waste that was dumped into the streets. But most cities and most towns and villages in the Roman world, including in Judea, did not have streets lined with sidewalks that were paved with high curbs like that. And that means that they would have been filled with waste that was dumped out from the houses. Now, there were cases where there were houses in the Roman world, including in Judea, that did have permanent toilet facilities. In those cases, typically what you have is, the analogy would be today, an outhouse, except that it's not usually an outhouse, it's usually a room in the house, but it's like an outhouse in that you have a cesspit that's dug into the floor of a room, and then you would have a stone or a wooden seat set over the cesspit. And what would happen then is that when the cesspit became filled and needed to be emptied, you would call a manure merchant who would come and empty the contents of the cesspit and sell them to be used as fertilizer for the agricultural fields, what we would call today night soil. By the way, I like to say that if we could be retrojected back 2,000 years in time, first of all, we would be bowled over by the odorama, and we would also all be dead within a week, because the produce was grown using night soil. And of course, the water, well, we can talk about that. The water that you were drinking also would have contained a lot of different organisms and bacteria and stuff like that, all sorts of things that cause sickness. This is why many of us get sick today when we travel to some countries in the world. If you go unprepared, I'm going to India next month, and I've already had a whole battery of immunizations in advance of that, right? And we lack the immunity to those diseases today. But people lived in this world, and you have to understand that this is the world of Jesus. So if you were fortunate enough to have a built toilet facility in your house, typically that's what it looked like. And a lot of the houses at Pompeii, which was kind of an upper middle class, if you wish, kind of a town, a lot of the houses at Pompeii have toilets like this. They're in a little cubicle like this with the little cesspit underneath. And you know what? Typically, those toilet facilities are located in a room that's next to the kitchen, because the cesspit was also used for the disposal of kitchen waste. Yeah. So that's what most of the toilets look like. Now, beginning in the 1st century BC and then going forward from there, the Romans also began to develop a very sophisticated kind of toilet facility, what's called a Roman luxury latrine. But these are very limited because of the way that they work. So usually Roman luxury latrines are a room that is part of a bathhouse. So you'll have a bathhouse, usually a public bathhouse, but if you were wealthy enough, you had a private one. But they're a room that's a part of a bathhouse. And the way that bathhouses work, they had different kinds of rooms. You would have water, a constant stream of fresh water being brought in by aqueduct, by a channel, and the water would be channeled through the rooms in the bathhouse. And then at the end, it would be channeled into a room that was used as a luxury latrine. And this room would consist of a room where you would have seats going around the sides of the room. And underneath the seats, you would have a channel. And the water flowing through the rest of the bathhouse would then be channeled underneath the seats, and it would carry the waste away. So you would sit on the seats, which again were of wood or of stone. You would sit on the seats, and the waste then would go down into the channel below and be carried away by the water in the channels. This is actually a very sophisticated kind of a toilet facility. But there are a couple of weird things about it for us. So one thing is, when you go into a Roman luxury latrine, the first thing that strikes us today is that you have rows of seats side by side, which meant that people went in full view of each other, which today, of course, is very strange for us. And of course, in the Roman world, there was no toilet paper. So what did people use? Well, at the base of the seats, there was a little channel, and that channel could be used for the spillage from the seats, but also it was used to place your what was used as toilet paper. It was a sponge on a stick. And so you would use the sponge on the stick to clean yourself. And then when you were done, you would put it back for the next person to come along. So that is a very sophisticated, but to us still yucky kind of toilet facility. And really, until we get to the 20th century, I don't think that, toilet facilities became more advanced than that kind of Roman luxury latrine. Now, the problem with Roman luxury latrines is that to work, you have to have a constant flow of water being brought in by an aqueduct. So really, for the period that we're talking about, the time we're talking about, and the place, Judea in the late Second Temple period, Roman luxury latrines really are not, not there. They're just not present yet. We don't have them. And so that's what's going on in terms of buildings. What do you do when you're outside and you have to go? Well, if you were lucky in the Roman world and you had access to a Roman luxury latrine, you might be able to use that. But otherwise, what you would do is just go anywhere. I mean, you would go wherever you could. And I found examples of shops at Pompeii where the shopkeepers wrote on the outside of the shops, "Don't go here." And there's actually Roman legislation from different places trying to prevent people from using public places for relieving themselves. So really, the toilet habits were a lot different than they are today. There was no idea of the connection between excrement and hygiene and disease. I mean, it may have been stinky, and so of course you don't want things to be stinky, but in terms of the idea that this causes disease, right? That is a concept which was not known in the Roman world. I don't know if you want to stop me, because I can now go on to what the Essenes did, which was a little different from everybody else.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So one of the really interesting things is that although Roman luxury latrines look so strange to us, where you can have up to 60 people sitting in full view of each other in one of these, luxury latrines, there's not a single author in the ancient Roman world who mentions that, because they took it for granted. I mean, they didn't write about toilet habits because everybody knew what you did, and it wasn't, there was nothing to describe. There's no there for them, right? But we do have literary evidence about the toilet habits of the Essenes. And we have this evidence from two of the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the ancient Jewish historian Josephus. And the scrolls that we have are the War Scroll and the Temple Scroll. And the War Scroll, of course, is a sectarian composition. The Temple Scroll, probably not, but it is found at Qumran and had some authority among the Qumran sect. And what we learned from those scrolls is that they believed that in the time of the final apocalyptic war, and that in their ideal city of Jerusalem in the future, that the toilets were to be placed at a certain distance from the war camps and from the ideal city of Jerusalem. If we focus on the city of Jerusalem, what's described in the Temple Scroll, there the toilets are described as being placed to the northwest of the city, 3,000 cubits, which means that they're beyond the Sabbath limits. That means that you cannot reach the toilets on the Sabbath. It's farther than you're allowed to walk on the Sabbath. More on that in just a minute. And the Temple Scroll describes the toilets very much as what we just talked about. This kind of an idea of an outhouse in a room. So basically you have a room that has a cesspit in it. It has a toilet seat over it. And the excrement, according to the Temple Scroll, is supposed to go down into the pit, meaning into the cesspit, and should not be visible to the eyes of God. And this is very interesting. They didn't want excrement, they didn't want defecation to be visible to the eyes of God. This actually is going back to their understanding, or whoever it was in this case who wrote the Temple Scroll, their understanding of a particular passage in Deuteronomy, which refers to the camps, in this case it's the desert camps, where when someone has to relieve themselves, and here we're talking strictly speaking about defecation, not urination, but when someone has to relieve themselves, they're supposed to go outside the camp and they take a little pick and they dig a hole in the ground, and then they go, they relieve themselves into the pit and they cover it up so that it should not be visible to the eyes of God. And then if we understand it as connected with the previous passage, which is the way that they understood it, you are then to immerse yourself and ritually purify yourself before you go back into the camp. So the Temple Scroll legislation and the War Scroll legislation took that passage from Deuteronomy and applied it to the war camps in this time of apocalyptic war and to the future city of Jerusalem. And then we get to Josephus. Josephus says about the Essenes, he says, on the Sabbath, they do not go to stool. They do not defecate on the Sabbath, which is really weird, right? But then you think about the legislation in the Temple Scroll, and also, by the way, in the War Scroll, where the toilets are located too far to be able to get to on the Sabbath, right? So it suggests, okay, more on that in a minute. And then he says, on all other days, what they do is they go out and they find a remote spot and they take the little pick that they're given when they become initiates into the sect, and they dig a little pit in the ground, and then they squat above it. And wrapping their mantle about them, that they may not offend the rays of the deity, the eyes of God, they relieve themselves, and then they replace the excavated soil into the pit. And then they wash themselves after it as if they're impure. So according to Josephus's description, what the Essenes did then was to take this passage again from Deuteronomy and apply it to their everyday lives. Now, that brings back the question about not going on the Sabbath. Well, how do you do that? I mean, right? People say, this, by the way, connects in with the question of fasting. Some scholars have suggested that maybe they fasted in advance of the Sabbath or on the Sabbath so that they wouldn't have to go. But we actually know that that's not the case, that they did not accept that you should fast on the Sabbath. They ate on the Sabbath. So then it brings up the question of, well, what did they do? What I think they did is they tried to abstain from defecating on the Sabbath. I think they tried. And the reason is, for the Qumran sect, the idea on the Sabbath was that the Sabbath was when you merged yourself with the presence of God. You came into the presence of God and literally tried to become like an angel, like one of God's angels. You like emulated what angels were. Angels don't defecate. And so the idea was that you were trying as much as possible to be an imitation of an angel, right? This imitation of the image of God. You tried to abstain from defecating if you had to go. And I'm sure that it happened, of course. And you have to realize, with all the diseases, there was probably dysentery. There were probably people with all sorts of parasites and stomach diseases. It would have been impossible to refrain all the time. But I do think it was an ideal that they tried to achieve. If you happened to go, then I think that it was considered what they would have considered to be an involuntary transgression. They distinguished, and also the rabbis did, by the way, between voluntary and involuntary. And therefore, there are no penalties stipulated for what happens if you do go on the Sabbath. But I do think it was an ideal. And I think that that's what Josephus is singling out in his description.
Did they give those people that violated that law of not using the restroom on Sabbath a warning of some kind, and they kept doing it?
Yeah, no, that's the thing. There's no penalties that are stipulated. So I think actually, again, it's just the kind of thing where it's an ideal that they tried to adhere to, but if you have to go, you have to go, and therefore I think that that they simply didn't have a penalty for it.
Right, so they let it slide because enforcing a rule like that would be obviously too difficult.
Exactly.
What were tombs and burial customs like in the 1st century CE?
Yeah, so it's kind of like toilet habits in the sense that there is a variety of them, right? People were buried, or their human remains were disposed of in various ways. Now, I think probably many of your listeners, if not most of them, are familiar with rock-cut tombs in Jerusalem of this period. We have the remains of approximately 1,000 rock-cut tombs of the late Second Temple period in the area of Jerusalem. They're very well documented. They're well known. They're highly visible in the archaeological landscape. And one of the criticisms that I have of some of my archaeological colleagues is that because rock-cut tombs are so visible, they're practically non-destructible, right? You have to blow them up, really, in order to get rid of them. But because they're so visible, they're so well preserved, they kind of dominate the archaeological conversation. And people tend to sort of focus on them as if that's the only method of burial that was used in the late Second Temple period. What I think, and I know I'm not the only one, but what I think is that, in fact, rock-cut tombs were used by only a small proportion of Jerusalem's population. And the reason is that they're very difficult to cut, because you have to cut them by hand. And in order to do that, that means that you have to be affluent enough to hire somebody to cut the rock cut tomb for you. So in my opinion, rock cut tombs are associated mainly, if not only, with the upper classes of Jewish society in the late Second Temple period, with a relatively small proportion of the overall population, and that the majority of the population was disposed of in ways that left few, if any, traces in the archaeological record that are not really nearly as visible. And this is actually true of the ancient world in general. It's been estimated that we have, I think, less than 1% of all ancient burials that have survived until today. So many people either were never properly disposed of, meaning their remains were never properly disposed of. Their remains got left somewhere. They got tossed into, random pits or empty cisterns or whatever. And we have references in rabbinic literature, for example, to this sort of thing. There's a wonderful passage in Suetonius's Life of Vespasian where he describes the emperor in Rome having his breakfast, and a dog trots in with a human arm that he's holding and drops it under the breakfast table. Because even in Rome, people, died. They were randomly, their remains were left around, and they got scavenged. You can probably remember the story of the death of Jezebel, right? Who's tossed out of the palace window. And what happens by the time they come to bury her? All that's left are her hands and feet, because the rest of her body had already been scavenged by dogs, right? So a lot of times people were never properly disposed of. It depended on whether you had enough money to make sure that your remains were properly disposed of, whether you had a family that was going to properly dispose of you. In fact, in the Roman world, people actually formed burial societies. They paid for and joined a burial society to ensure that when they died, somebody would take care of their remains, right? So a lot of times people simply were not properly disposed of, and their remains were randomly tossed wherever. In Rome, there were giant pyres, funerary pyres, because the Romans in this period practiced cremation. So your remains might be brought and thrown into the funerary pyre. Otherwise, and now we're back to Judea, if you were not affluent enough to have a rock cut tomb, or if you had somebody to take care of you, but and your remains are not randomly disposed of, then typically you would be buried in the way that we bury our dead today, which is basically what I call a trench grave. It might be a cyst grave. It could be cut into rock, but usually it's more cut into the ground, where you would literally dig a trench 6 feet deep, take the individual's body, wrap it in a shroud, maybe put it in a wooden coffin, lay the body at the base of the trench, fill the trench in with dirt, and then maybe erect a headstone at one end. At Qumran, this is the kind of burial that we have at Qumran. There's a whole cemetery with this kind of grave. At Qumran, they actually marked these trench graves with heaps of stones, and a headstone at one end and a headstone at the other end, or a footstone at one end. But this is probably the most common kind of non-elite burial in antiquity, and it survived right up until today. I mean, the Bedouins throughout the ages have buried their dead in a manner like this. And in fact, at Qumran, there are some Bedouin burials that have been confused with the ancient Essene burials, the ancient sectarian burials. And of course, this is very much the way many people still in the West bury their dead today, right? By digging a trench in the ground. So that's the way that I think a lot of people would have been buried. The problem is that these kinds of graves typically do not leave a lot of visible remains in the archaeological landscape, because they're easily buried, covered over, plowed up. We have them at Qumran because it's in the desert. It wasn't built over afterwards. The other problem is when we do find them, they're often very hard to date, because the individuals were often buried without any burial goods. And the same types of burials are used throughout many periods of time and by different kinds of populations, not just Jews, but all sorts of different peoples. So when you do find them in the archaeological landscape, they're often difficult to date. At Qumran, we can associate them with the sectarian community there. So it's a really good example of this kind of a cemetery. But otherwise, they're often overlooked by archaeologists.
Can you tell us about the burial of Jesus and if it resembles the typical burial customs?
Yeah, so in the case of the gospel accounts of Jesus's burial, it's very interesting. So the gospel accounts describe Jesus, of course, being crucified. He dies on the cross sometime on Friday afternoon, towards the end of the afternoon on Friday. And what happens at that point is that a wealthy and apparently socially prominent follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea rushes to Pontius Pilate, the governor, and asks permission to take Jesus's body and bury it. And he's given permission, and he takes the body, and what he does is he has the body placed in his family's own rock-cut tomb which apparently was located not far from the site where the crucifixion had occurred. And then, according to the accounts, he rolls a great stone over the entrance to the tomb and he goes away. Now, there's a lot of really interesting things about this. So first of all, this picture of Jesus's body being placed in a rock-cut tomb by a wealthy and prominent follower of his is consistent with what we know about how these sorts of elite people disposed of their dead in this period. That is, as an elite member of Jewish society in Jerusalem in the first century, yes, Joseph of Arimathea's family presumably did own a rock-cut tomb, right? And so what's important here is that Joseph burying Jesus in his family's rock-cut tomb was not normal. It was not normal to take somebody else who is not related to you and put them in your family's tomb. It would be similarly abnormal today if you have, let's say, a family mausoleum, to take somebody who's not a family member and put them in your family's mausoleum. It's very much that same idea. So why did Joseph of Arimathea take Jesus's body and put it in his family's rock-cut tomb? I think that here there are two biblical Jewish laws that underlie what's happening in this episode. So there's a Jewish law which says that every criminal, even the worst criminals, are entitled to a burial in accordance with biblical Jewish law, which mandates that you should be buried within 24 hours of death. This, by the way, is why Jews today generally don't have wakes, because the idea, it's an ideal, is that you should be buried within 24 hours of death. By the way, if you're not buried within 24 hours of death, nothing happens to you. It's not like you go to hell or purgatory or something like that. But it's an ideal again, and many Jews try to follow that, right? So even criminals are entitled to being buried within 24 hours of death. On the other hand, there's a biblical law that prohibits burial on the Sabbath and festivals. So what's happening here? It's the eve of the Sabbath. It's just about sundown. Jesus has just expired on the cross. And what's going to happen? Now, under ordinary circumstances, Jesus would probably, if his body was properly disposed of, he would have been buried in a trench grave, right? So somebody would have come, dug a trench grave for him, and placed his body in the trench grave. But at this point, apparently, he'd been abandoned by his followers, right? There's nobody around. There was nobody there to dig a trench grave before the Sabbath started. It was almost sundown. And if you waited until after the end of the Sabbath, the following evening, to bury his body, to dig a trench grave and bury his body, you would have exceeded the 24-hour deadline. And so I believe that Joseph wanted to see that Jesus, who he was a follower of Jesus, wanted to make sure that Jesus was buried in accordance with biblical law. And so to ensure this, he went to Pilate, asked for Jesus's body, takes it and places it in his family's own rock-cut tomb, closes the stone, and goes away. Now, I don't want to, by the way, sound like I'm promoting any kind of conspiracy theories or anything, but I'm just going to point out that there's nothing in biblical law that would then prohibit you from taking that body from the tomb after the Sabbath ended and reburying it somewhere else. Nothing to prohibit that. But by doing what he did, Joseph ensured that Jesus received a proper burial in accordance with biblical law.
And what became of the Jewish purity laws after the destruction of the temple in 7 BCE?
Right. Well, the Jewish purity laws never went away. I mean, they're still there in the 5 books of Moses. What changes is that the need, I don't even want to say the need, but the possibility of observing some of these laws disappeared with the temple, right? So after the temple is destroyed in 70, many of the laws govern the cult in the Jerusalem temple. So once there's no temple, then any laws that relate to the temple obviously can no longer be followed, right? So if someday the temple's rebuilt, then presumably those laws would be in effect. And so what happens in the case of the other laws is that the rabbis who eventually become the sort of religious leaders in Jewish society in some of, the centuries following the destruction of the temple, reinterpret biblical law in light of the changed circumstances and the absence of the temple. They reinterpret those laws in accordance with the changed circumstances, so that some of those purity laws are still followed until today. For example, observant Jews, before they get married, might immerse themselves in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, right, to purify themselves. So some of those laws get reinterpreted in light of the changed circumstances. There are other laws that simply it's impossible to observe anymore without a temple, in the absence of a temple.
And after the Bar Kokhba War ended, how much did that affect Judaism, their laws, the way they were thinking? How much of that was that affected?
Right. So the Bar Kokhba revolt is, a lot of, I think, people who are not scholars may overlook the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a second Jewish revolt against the Romans from the years, well, it's usually said 132 to 135, probably a little bit longer than that. And it's called the Bar Kokhba revolt because the leader of the revolt was a messianic figure named Bar Kokhba. That was a nickname. And it's a revolt that's very important. It's a revolt that apparently broke out because Hadrian, the Roman emperor at the time, announced plans to rebuild Jerusalem as a pagan Roman city called Aelia Capitolina and build a new temple on the Temple Mount dedicated not to the God of Israel, but dedicated to the Roman god Capitoline Jupiter. And this sparks the outbreak of this revolt. And it's a revolt which had devastating consequences for the Jewish population. As a result of the revolt, much of Judea was emptied of its Jewish settlements. Hadrian goes ahead and rebuilds Jerusalem as a pagan Roman city, establishes a shrine or a temple, apparently, to Capitoline Jupiter on the Temple Mount. And this basically seals the fate of the temple. It's clear after the Bar Kokhba revolt that the Jerusalem temple is not going to be rebuilt at any time in the near future. And it's really at this point that you really have to make a decision which way you're going to go. I have to say there probably were followers of Jesus and his movement at this point who may have been fence sitting, waiting to see what's going to happen with the temple. Because of course, if you're all in on Jesus and you believe that he is in fact the Messiah and that he is the Son of God, then you have no more need for an earthly temple, right? You believe Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice, that you can atone for your sins by accepting Jesus as that sacrifice. There may have been followers of Jesus at this point, especially, I think, probably among the Jewish population, who were fence sitting and waiting to see, well, wait a minute, what's going to happen here? At this point, it's clear there's no longer going to be a temple. You have to decide what way you're going to go. And there may be people at this point who said then, okay, we have here a substitute. Jesus is the sacrifice, no more need for an earthly temple. And that, some people go in that direction. What happens in Judaism proper is that this is a long process. It happens over centuries. But eventually, this group of men who we call rabbis or sages, they're not to be confused with a modern day rabbi who is often a leader in a synagogue. But there's a group of men, these rabbis or sages, who established themselves as sort of the authorities in the reinterpretation of Jewish law. They follow that Pharisaic principle of oral law. They take the written laws as they were written in the 5 books of Moses, and they use this principle of oral law to reinterpret many of those biblical laws in light of the changed circumstances. And it's thanks to their reinterpretation of these biblical laws that Judaism was able to survive the trauma of the loss of the temple and survive until today. And I can guarantee you that 2,000 years ago, Jews would never have imagined that 2,000 years later, we would still have Judaism without a temple. That's not something that they would have imagined. They took a temple for granted, right? So it's really thanks to the approach of the rabbis and this approach of oral law that Judaism was able to survive the loss of the temple and adapt to the changed circumstances.
I would like to now shift to your work on the Handwashing Mosaic. I know you've talked about in the past that Antiochus, it's either Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes or it's Alexander the Great. What caused you to lean towards it's Alexander the Great versus it being Antiochus?
Right. So one of the mosaic panels that we have at Handwashing is a panel that we call the Elephant Mosaic or the Elephant panel. It's also up on the National Geographic website. So if your listeners would like to go and see it, they can see it. It's great because you can zoom in on details and stuff. And what you see is a big rectangular panel, which is divided into 3 horizontal strips or registers that get bigger as you go towards the top. And it's apparently a panel that tells a story, a narrative, that starts at the bottom and ends at the top. And the bottom part seems to show the aftermath of a battle. The middle part shows a series of male figures framed by arches with lighted oil lamps above them. And the upper register shows a meeting between 2 large male figures, one who is clearly got the attributes of a Greek king, so meaning either Alexander the Great or one of his Greek successors, and the other apparently a Jewish male who's bearded and elderly and dressed all in white, and is accompanied by a bunch of young men also dressed in white, and they're holding swords. So this panel, I have a large staff at Hukok, and I have 2 specialists who are working on the publication of the mosaics, Karen Britt and Ranan Bustan. And they published this mosaic back in 2018 as a monograph, as a little book. And in their monograph, they explored the various possible interpretations of this mosaic. Now, I should actually backtrack and say that when we discovered this mosaic, we immediately recognized its significance, because in that uppermost register with that Greek military commander king figure, there are 2 battle elephants with shields tied to their sides. And the significance of this is that there are no stories in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that involve battle elephants. And so when we discovered this mosaic, we realized immediately that what we have here is apparently the very first depiction of a non-biblical story ever discovered in an ancient synagogue. The question is, what story is it? The figures aren't labeled. So Karen and Ranan in their monograph explored various possible interpretations. And I think that you can group the interpretations into some categories. So my Alexander interpretation, more on that in a minute. Then there are many scholars who like an interpretation connected with the Maccabees, the books of the Maccabees. And Karen and Ranan favor an interpretation connected with the Hasmoneans, which means the successors of the Maccabees. Now, why do I think that it's Alexander? It's, in my opinion, it's clearly got to be a Greek king. So again, either Alexander or one of his Greek successors. And one of the reasons that I think that it's Alexander is because the figures are not labeled. And it's a mosaic panel in an early 5th century synagogue in Galilee. And that means that whatever story is depicted in this panel would have had to have been so obvious to the Jews who entered that synagogue that it didn't need an explanation. And the problem is that once you get into the stories with the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans or whatever, that then you get into a whole world of possibilities, and it could be this, and it could be this, and scholars have made cases for all of them. But there was only one king in antiquity, from the Hellenistic period on, who was so great that he didn't need a label, and that's Alexander the Great. So I think that it has to be Alexander. We know that the story of Alexander meeting the Jewish high priest, which is a legendary story, but we know that this story circulated among the Jewish population in this period because we have it written down in rabbinic literature. We have it in another source called Pseudo-Callisthenes. It's also in Josephus earlier. So we know that this was a popular story that circulated in different versions among the Jewish population. And in my opinion, number one, given that the story was well known, and number two, given that the figures are not labeled and it would have had to have been obvious, there's only one king that fits the bill of being so great that he needs no label, that this would be understood by everyone who entered the synagogue. In my opinion, it has to be Alexander the Great. I haven't actually written this up myself because Karen and Ranan actually did a very good job of exploring that possibility, even though they don't agree with it. And the fact is that that's what I think. It's my opinion, but I'm not, I don't really have a huge investment in it, in the sense that, for me, the mosaics at Hukok are an amazing, spectacular find, but that was not the goal of my excavations. The goal of my excavations was not to find nice mosaics, which we did. The goal of my excavations was to try and address a couple of big research questions that I had about Jewish settlements in this region in late antiquity when they come under Christian rule. What is the date of a synagogue like the synagogue at Hukok, which has other parallels in other synagogues in the area? So the mosaics for me are not a focus, and therefore I've never felt personally invested enough to sit and write a whole argument about why I think it's Alexander. And I also think that it's fine. Everybody has their opinions. Everybody's entitled to their opinions, and it's still an ongoing debate. Just within the last month, another scholarly article came out. There are at least 10 articles that I know of that came out since Karen and Raanan published their monograph with different interpretations. And yet another one appeared within the last month in the latest issue of Dumbarton Oaks Papers. And that's fine. That's what we do as scholars.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jodi Magness.
Well, thank you for having me, Jacob. It's a pleasure to meet you in person.
Yeah, same here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.